start? Let me unmute here. You good? Good? Oh yeah, that's loud. And as soon as I say that, more people come in. Wow. All right, let's go. BSides Nashville. How's everybody doing? Good? Everybody have a good day? Anybody learn anything? Yes, awesome, awesome. My name is Butturini. This is Chunky Cookies Smashing Application-Aware Defenses. When I say application-aware defenses, how many people kind of have an idea of what I'm talking about? Well, you wrote a book on it. You don't count. So, anyway, yeah, no. So if you don't, we're going to go over it. But, yeah, let's jump right into it and see if we can get through this. So, a little bit about me. I'm not a good self-promoter, but I'm a pen tester at a large health insurance company who I have to say, by threat of being fired, I'm not representing them here today. It rhymes with cabana, so you can guess which one that is. I've been doing IT for about 13 years, a little everything. I started network and infrastructure, doing server admin and Active Directory. I'm a Microsoft certified solitaire expert on Windows 2000, which makes me highly qualified. And so, yeah, and believe it or not, Active Directory hasn't changed that much. But moved into the security side about 9 years ago, started doing that full time, pen testing, a lot of web app stuff and mobile and security infrastructure. Another shameless self-plug, I'm the author of NoSQL Map, which I presented here at BSides Nashville, the very first BSides Nashville, 3 or 4 years ago, and it's taken off, and appreciate everybody who supported that tool. And I always put this disclaimer in my presentations. I am the world's worst PowerPointer. That's about the most artistic colors I can come up with. But you know what? They work on every projector in the world. So I'm going to stick with them. And I'm not a role model for public speaking. So I will probably pick my nose and ah and do everything else wrong during this talk. And I really should go to Toastmasters and learn how to speak someday. But, you know, when I have free time. So, quick agenda. Why are we doing this talk? Why are you all here at 4:20 in the afternoon? Because you thought there were going to be cookies and it's 4:20, clearly. But, yeah. So, no, a review of application awareness, if you don't know what I'm talking about. And so then we're going to dive into some of the weaknesses of these application aware security controls that we implement. And then the last half of talking about focus on a tool called FireWay. This is a tool I originally presented at DerbyCon last year and a little 25-minute talk on Sunday. What you're going to see today is a complete rewrite and revamp of that tool. It's all new, totally different. You guys are the first ones to see it. And I have it on my GitHub for you guys to play with. And hopefully some time for questions and comments and whatever level of profanity we're allowed here towards me at the end. So, why give this talk? This is what I see a lot of. I went to a lot of conferences last year, and this is just kind of what people do now. You go in a pen test talk, and it's macro and Office doc and fish somebody, and you get to do PowerShell and Empire and all that stuff, and then you pivot around and you jump, escalate. Eventually become a domain admin, and you write a report and collect a check, and you're done. And that's awesome. I'm not degrading that in any way. There's people doing a lot of really creative and inventive ways, and it just keeps getting better and harder to detect. But this is the problem with that. More and more enterprises, more and more your internal and external customers are trying to adopt this mentality, which is the assume breach mentality. Has anybody heard of this? Okay, yeah. This is we know we can't stay ahead of attackers. We know we can't patch 100%. Who's ever gotten 100% patch success with SCCM? Yeah, anybody who raised their hand is lying. We know our users are going to do dumb things. They're going to click on links. We're going to get breached. So we're going to make our best effort to keep bad things from happening, but we're going to spend most of our energy on detection, isolation, and remediation quickly. So, if you're doing this, all you're doing is proving to something they either know or assume they know is already happening. So, it devalues your penetration testing exercise. So, this is where I think it's time for us as pen testers to be creative. I don't know how many people are pen testers this talk. Just for fun, if you're a pen tester or want to be a pen tester, raise your hand. Okay. That's why you're in the red track, I guess. That's good. That was kind of a dumb question, wasn't it? But I think we should start going after these detective controls. So things like application-aware firewalls, next-gen firewalls, DLP, antivirus, and we do a little bit, but I think that should be a very important focal point in our test. The other thing I think is really important that I see a lot of companies miss in penetration testing engagements is data exfiltration. And the theoretical, we get into the network, we pivot around, we get these elevated levels of privileges, And saying, because I had this, I could do this is one thing. Actually doing an exercise of some sort where data leaves because that's what costs companies money and puts them out of business, that's a whole different level. So I think that's something that's very important to scope. And you don't have to use real data. Most companies for development purposes have something that can de-identify data. And you can use fake data that looks like real data that their control should stop leaving. And guys, I'm concerned about the state of pen testing right now because I see two sort of conflicting directions things are going. We have regulatory compliance type things like PCI, which require so much pen testing. Like if you have a system and it gets a whiff of a credit card number, it has to be pen tested at least yearly and sometimes quarterly, depending on what it does. So you have this group of let's make money off pen testing companies over here that are trying to do it at scale by just deploying automation, scripts, people who don't really know what they're doing, just know how to run scans. And you have a group of over here of companies like Black Hills Information Security, Trusted Sec, Guardians, who want to do things the right way. And doing creative things, showing value, doing this type of activity is what's going to keep that doing things the right way alive and maybe keep this cheap scale pen testing out. So, diving into application awareness. This is that thing you guys learned for your CCNA and then forgot after the exam was over, probably. I don't know. I did. It was a thing, all people seem to need data processing. Please do not throw sausage pizza away. That's the way I learned it anyway. I used to teach this, so. But this is the OSI model, and so this is actually the layers of building a connection from the cable plug in the wall, physical, to the payload, the data you're actually transmitting, application layer 7 at the top. And I like the way this diagram is laid out, 7 to 1, because you can think of each layer as a building block. So you have to have its predecessor before you can get to the next layer. And you'll see why that's important here in a little bit. So in the beginning, not so long ago, and we still do today, we looked only at layer 3 and layer 4, right? IP, and that's the network layer and the transport layer. So where's something coming from? IP address, where's it going to? What port's it connecting on? What port's it coming from sometimes? And we just sort of allowed or denied it. And there's some examples of the technologies we used. Pretty simple stuff. And stuff, again, it's not so long ago we used this stuff, but it's still prevalent today. But as processing power started to increase, right, we started to be able to take more deep looks at traffic and move more traffic faster while we're looking deep. So we were able to look all the way up the stack, right? So we were able to look into the payload and start making more complex decisions. And you can think of things like load balancers and proxies where you're actually terminating the connection and you can rewrite the payload effectively to something you want. Next generation firewalls. Who's worked the next generation firewall in here? Something like Palo Alto, Barracuda. Okay, yeah. Those are my people right there. I don't work for a vendor. I just have had to work for them. Work with the platforms. But DLP, both network-based and client-side, where are you looking? You're looking inside the payload, inside the flow. Anomaly detection filters, and that's sort of a gray area we'll talk about. SSL decryption, breaking open encryption, and URL filtering. You don't think of URL filtering as like a layer 7 type technology, but what are you doing? You're looking at a flow and looking at HTTP request and response inside it. So, why are these things broken? Let's talk about that. What happens to the network device you plug into your network that introduces a bunch of latency and operational impact? You have a really, really nice, expensive paperweight on your desk, don't you? It's a resume generator too, right? So, while these platforms make big promises that, we can do all this inspection and we can do all these wonderful things and detect every app and every piece and part of Facebook and, it's great. You still have to move the packet down the wire very, very quickly. So, you can look at things fast in a couple of different ways. Number one is you only look at the traffic going one way. So, I'm going to look at what goes out. I'm going to make a layer 7 decision on what goes out. I'm not going to match it up with what comes back and kill the flow based on it. That's very, very important. The other thing I've seen these platforms do is they take shortcuts. So, I've got one up here. If you send traffic on port 443 and base 64 encode it, and the firewall can't read it, it just says, that's cool. I can't read that. It's on port 443. It must be TLS. So if you have a rule that permits TLS, and even though if it's not really TLS, and you've obfuscated it some other way, firewall will let the traffic out. So I'm going to give you an example, and those of you who have worked with these platforms probably know exactly which vendor. We're not going to name names. But this is a vendor's firewall, and this is their Skype signature. And I want you to look at the line that says standard ports. I'm sorry, I've been trying to get sick all week, so I'm trying to hold up through this. But you see where it says TCP dynamic and UDP dynamic? That's their code word for any. So if, say, I permit, not that this would ever happen, but I'm just going to permit any, but it has to match Skype. What I've effectively done is I put a rule in my firewall that says I'm going to allow, as a TCP any rule or UDP any rule, traffic from everywhere to everywhere up to the amount of data that the firewall needs to figure out if the traffic is Skype or not. So if you blend a rule like this, a layer 7 rule, and there's a number of apps with this type of characteristic, and it doesn't even have to be any. So you could say traffic can leave on port 443, but it has to be this app that we know runs on port 443. It can really be any type of traffic, and the firewall will bleed it out until it figures out, like, this is or is not Skype or Instagram or whatever app. And we're going to pick a lot on HTTP today, and there's a reason for that, and we'll get into that here in a little bit. So DLP. There's network-based DLP, client DLP. How many people have implemented DLP or worked with it? Okay, I'm sorry. So DLP suffers from what I like to term the antivirus problem, and a lot of other people term it. Why do we talk about antivirus? Why do we like rag on it and say it's dead? What's sort of the core reason? It's signature-based. It's based on static signatures and patterns. And we sit there and we say that like, oh, it's only antivirus. But it's everything. It's IPS signatures. It's next-generation firewalls. It's DLP. What are DLP rules made of? They're made of regexes that look like what? Credit card numbers, social security numbers, medical terms, right? So if we deviate just a little bit to the left or the right off these signatures, then DLP fails. So if you have a file full of credit card numbers and you base 64 encode it, what happens to it? The DLP waves it on down the wire and says goodbye, good luck, right? And the other thing with DLP, it often gets tuned way, way, way down. How many people have had to tune DLP? Oh, she's not, so, because you don't want the receptionist sending email, to her husband says, hey, Tom, Sally's dentist appointment is at 3, and she gets a big box and an alert that says, oh, you're trying to send PHI out. I see the word dentist, right? So it gets tuned way down. So you have a lot of flexibility in, bypassing these things by sending data in chunks, which we'll get to. So the other thing about DLP, and I lumped URL filtering in here because I was too lazy to make another slide about URL filtering, but they make decisions, and you guys have tuned DLP, oftentimes the rules are based like, I don't want to let certain types of data into social networking. I don't want to let certain types of data into webmail, right? How does it decide it's webmail? Well, it's HTTP, our old friend. So, and it's based strictly on the method, the path, and the host name. And URL filtering pretty much usually just makes it on the host. So, what if I send something like this to a server I own? Remember we talked about one-way inspection? So I'm going to send this, the URL filterer, or the DLP, whatever, is going to say, all right, yeah, that was you going to LinkedIn. It ignores the other header, because it doesn't know how to look at the other header. My server knows how to look at the other header, goes and gets the content for that other domain, timewastinggames.com, which I changed because I remember where we were giving this presentation. It was much more graphic. But, never mind, I was about to say something different. But, and it returns the content. Because the content is never inspected coming back, it's only inspected going out, the control fails. Boy, I'm flying here. Okay. Anomaly detection engines. These come in varying flavors and degrees of complexity, right? How many people have ever implemented an anomaly detection engine? Something like, what's one? Dark Trace, or turned on some anomaly engines on your firewalls. Like that, I know the ASA has one that's pretty good. So, yeah, Splunk has one, So these can range from very, very simple, looking at connections, addresses, ports, to learned heuristic behavior of, I see this client usually talks to this at 3 p.m. and now it's talking to this, or it's talking to this at 3 a.m. instead of 3 p.m., that kind of thing. And I consider them sort of a layer 7 or a next-gen type control because they do look at the aggregate amount of data transferred a lot. So they're still reliant on patterns, though. There's that same core issue we come back to. Again, right? It's static patterns. unless it's one of the really, really, really advanced ones. So how do you beat them? You randomize what you're doing. You don't engage in some pattern of behavior that's different. You talk to something different on a different time interval. Time will throw almost every anomaly detection engine I've seen off if you don't do it in a regular basis, because at some point they have a threshold where you start relearning what you're trying to do. So you connect, and then you wait 30 seconds to connect again. And you wait 15 minutes to connect again. And every time you're doing something a little bit different, maybe you're changing the IP you're talking to, maybe you're changing the amount of data you're transferring, it will actually bypass a lot of the anomaly detection engines out there, unless you get one of the really, really, really big ones like Darktrace or something like that. So this is where data chunking starts to come in. So if we have a big, we talked about DLP and some things like that, if we have a big file, let's say full of credit cards or a database table we've extracted, and we need to move it, is it better to move it all in one giant transmission to one place? Or if we split it into a whole bunch of little teeny parts and send it a whole bunch of different places? And of course what's different now is we have access to a tremendous amount of computing power really, really, really quickly. And so I can spin up a lot of servers to receive my data, and my work effort is all done outside the purview of the detective controls on the inside to reassemble it. So I can spend as much time as I want trying to put it back together. I just got to get it out. And I can get it by my controls like my next-gen firewall, my app proxies, and my DLP. A lot of DLP I should have mentioned too. If it's a real small amount of data, they'll just, you couldn't be exfiltrating anything, you'll just ignore it. So I do have a slide with Donald Trump on it, I'm sorry. But I'm going to tell you a little bit of a funny story. So I was working on this talk before DerbyCon last year. And I had just been putting the code on my GitHub, and I don't have a private GitHub or anything. And I was thinking, nobody's going to find this. Nobody's looking at my GitHub. And I was going through Twitter one night, and I see this tweet, and it's about this tool I'm writing. And I was, holy crap! How did this happen? And so I sort of traced it back, and it was PeerList, I think. Somebody had found it and written an article on PeerList about a glowing, wonderful article, and the guy had found the code, and he had downloaded it, set up a bunch of proof of concepts, and said, this is great. And I'm reading through the comments, and one of the guys said, well, I don't understand the point of this tool. We just encrypt the data and move it. It's easy. There's no point to this. And when we know how this guy feels about encryption, right? What does he say? He says, just using encryption, that arouses suspicion. And, as we're sitting in this room and we're all individuals, we say, no, man, no, encryption's for confidentiality, it's privacy. And me too, I agree. But you can't take that away, and just using it shouldn't arouse suspicion. But the thing is, when we go to our day job, we look like this. If we see a bunch of encrypted traffic moving somewhere, it's not supposed to move, right? We're like, oh, hold on, why is the receptionist PC sending a bunch of TLS traffic to Russia? It arouses suspicion, so we're a little bit hypocritical in that way, but that's all right. The other piece of it is encryption tends to be very, very noisy, So there's a connection stand-up, usually, some kind of handshake that occurs in clear text, and if you can be looking for that kind of thing, you can find it where it shouldn't be easily. It also makes for a really bad POC if we're testing a lot of these controls. Many times they're implemented and we know, like, our DLP can't see inside SSL. We don't forward proxy. So we talked about proving known knowns earlier and how it devalues the exercise. Why not try to do things in a manner such that it's done in a way that we think that our tool should be able to stop it? We transmit data in clear text or something like that, something that should be easy for it to smack down, right? Or detect. So that's where we're going to jump into FireWay. I have this link again at the end. I presented this at DerbyCon. This is a totally new version, and that's for testing DLP, for testing layer 7 controls, anomaly detection engines. Pretty much a multi-purpose tool, could do a lot of different things. I should also mention, I was going to do a live demo of this, and there was a lot of just like standing the server up and tearing it down and typing, and so it was really time-consuming and pointless, and you guys would have been bored, and you would have been sitting watching me type, and I'm not Mavis Beacon, and I don't type that well. So you're going to have to deal with screenshots, but I promise you, if you'll take the code, try to get your controls, it will work, and it will work really well. I've used all the concepts we're going to talk about on penetration tests, and on security audits and against a multitude of different platforms and vendors, and it has worked pretty much every time. So let's jump right into it. So first thing we're getting to is test data mode, and this is really intended for testing that data leakage principle of if, say, I have a next generation firewall with layer 7 rules and layer 3-4 rules blended together, is my firewall leaking data across a particular type of rule? So basically what this will do is it will open a connection, send a random amount of, or a randomly generated data in an amount you specify out, and then on the next connection, increment it a little bit, on the next connection, increment a little bit to figure out where the threshold is and how much data you're bleeding out the firewall. So, this is the setup for the server. There's a server, there's a client, and then there's a reassembler. There's actually 2 clients. But, you see Python, the server, or the script name. That is a port that is closed in my instance, and we'll take a look at that. And the mode is on the end. Now, there's a README on the GitHub that explains what the modes are. If you just run the script, it'll tell you what all the modes are and explain everything. But, and these slides will be up there as well at the end for reference. But you see, the server starts up somewhere past the decision point of your firewall, like the internet. Server started as sequential test data mode. It's ready to accept some data. These screenshots are terrible. I'm sorry. The client. Start the client. That can be a list of places, depending on what you want to test. Like, so if you have a file name with just a list of IPs, it'll parse through it and just pick them at random, or you can specify a single IP. There's the closed port, and there's mode 0. So you see we're going to specify initial number of bytes to test. So on our first connection, we're going to send 50 bytes. On each new connection, we're going to send 25 more bytes, so 50, 75 bytes, 100 bytes, all the way up to about 4K. And then I forgot to take a screenshot of this actually running, so I'd use an old screenshot, but, yeah. So what you'll see happening here is the client is running on the left, the server is running on the right. The server knows it should get more data on each consecutive connection. You guys kind of follow what I'm saying? So when you hit a threshold where it's getting the same or less data, it warns you. It says, I got the same amount of data or less on I changed the wording of that. 2 consecutive connections, maximum data leak size may have been reached. This will probably make more sense when we look at the firewall logs. So here's my sanitized firewall logs. And so what you see happening, and the firewall wonderfully writes logs out of order, which really aggravated me. But you see different connections with different amounts of data flowing across them, right? You see this app type is set as insufficient data. That's basically the firewall saying, look, man, I see there's a layer 7 rule. I don't have enough data to say for sure if it is or is not a match. I'm going to pass the traffic out. And this is really funny. I use this is probably bad for this example. There is a layer 7 signature for ping. So just ICMP echo and echo reply. That signature will let you stand up a full TCP connection, pass data across it, and close it down, and the firewall still can't figure out if it's like a match or not, which is beyond comprehension. But anyway, so we're sending more and more data. And more, and more, and more, and more. And you see, we eventually get to a point up here where we hit about 6K of data. It says unknown TCP. So I know what the application is. What the firewall starts saying is, I know it's not that thing you have the layer 7 rule for. But 2 things about that. You've already leaked the data out. So the firewall has already passed data on a port that is actually closed by my egress filtering. I should have said that to start with. Port 8080 is not allowed, but because it was trying to match that layer 7 signature, it was passing the data out anyway. So, you guys get the concept? We can communicate out on closed ports and bypass egress filtering by using small transaction sizes. So, that's pretty cool, right? But let's do something a little more useful than just sending random data out. Starts busting up a file, and I've got 3 different ways we're going to do this, each one a little more complex than the last. So, test your DLP, test your firewall. One thing I've also noticed, and I don't know if you guys have ever seen this, when egress filtering is in place, I've seen security operations centers that just say, man, our firewall filtering, our outbound filtering is tight. We're going to build all our dashboards around the ports we know that are allowed. Then they never look at ports they think are closed. So if you have a problem like this, where the firewall is leaking data across ports they think are closed, then they don't know. And I've gotten away with this a couple times, doing that. So, Test your DLP as well if you're just sending small pieces of data. In this example, we're sending the data out in order. So we're going to bust the file up and send it out, first part, second part, third part. So we'll start up the server again. This time we're going to use mode 1 on the end. I'm still going to use my closed port of 8080. You see it says started in timestamp reassembly mode. Because we know the chunks are being sent one at a time, and they're being sent in order, we can use the time the piece was received as our key for reassembling it. Now, I'm not using disk write time. I'm actually using network connection time. So if there is latency in disk writes, it doesn't impact this. Now, you see you have this other thing that says using that % dollar ampersand right parentheses as reassembly key. That is just a delimiter to stick between the pieces of the file. The idea is to generate something random that would never actually exist in a file, hopefully, unless you get really, really lucky. And because depending on how big your file is and how small your chunks are, I didn't want to write to like separate files. So I just stream it all into one file, and then we put it back together later. So, server's ready. This example, I have changed. I'm using the client. I'm actually specifying a file name with a list of servers, and truth be told, I was really too lazy to build more than 2 VMs. So, I just ran one server on my loopback address, and I ran one server on a remote IP. See, we specified the file went exfiltrate. I'm using a copy of the GPL just because it was handy and it has lots of neat white space and stuff, and so it's kind of cool to prove that you can break this stuff up and reassemble the file in order. Send it 640 byte pieces. The client will just start picking things randomly out of the file in the list and transmit them, and you see it's going in order. So first piece, second piece, third piece, fourth piece, fifth piece, sixth piece. I decided not to just show you guys firewall logs over and over and over again because you guys kind of understand the concept from what we looked at just a minute ago. So there's already 55 slides in this. I didn't want anybody's eyes to glaze over. So, to show you what I'm talking about, here's an example of the stream on the server. We have a Unix epoch timestamp. We have a delimiter, the chunk of the file, and then another delimiter. And then you see the second piece starts with the timestamp and another delimiter. So, we'll reassemble our file using FAssembler, another script. We'll run it in mode 1. Like I said, you can run the scripts with no parameters, and I'll show you what each mode means and when to use what, and a comma-separated list of our file names. So what I've done is I've pulled the files all into one folder, and it will ask for that 4-character reassembly key from the servers. You can get it from the server when you start it, or you can just look in the file and find the first 4 characters, so you can probably script this out pretty easily. Reassembly complete. And there's our output. Looks pretty good, right? So we took a file, sent it a bunch of different places, or 2 in my example, but it could be 2 or 200. It really doesn't matter. And put it back together on the outside. So that's pretty good, but, spacing across multiple flows, multiple servers, that helps, but we're still sending data out in order. And if any kind of aggregator or anything like that is in use, it would be pretty easy to figure out what was going on. So, make it a little harder. And I jokingly call this reverse BitTorrent. Obviously, BitTorrent is much more complex, right? But you think of the principle of BitTorrent. Everybody advertises pieces into a tracker, and the tracker tells you where to go get the piece. Well, we're doing this in the reverse order. Instead of pulling pieces from places, we're going to push pieces to places. And the only thing we really need to do is be able to describe somewhere what order the pieces are being sent in. And as long as that place is accessible to us, then we can put the file back together. So the first thing we're going to do is generate a sequence key. Now bear in mind, I'm not a math, cryptography, or any other type of complicated major, and I barely graduated from college, so who can guess how this is formatted? No. You're making it much too hard. How about I do that? We're going to send piece 17 first, 18 second, 10 third, 51 fourth, 34 fifth. And I could put random amounts of padding between them, but no, it's just numbers. And I just put a random character between the numbers. And I could put more characters between the numbers too. That would be easy to do. Mental note. But we're going to transmit that somewhere. It was wonderful. I was watching a bunch of Adrian's presentations on an aside here because I have a lot of time. Adrian was recording talks, and everybody that got up was like, I was a quadruple major in artificial intelligence and warfare and Latin and basketball at some little college that's so good you've never heard of it. And I was like, man, I'm never telling anybody where I went to college in one of my presentations. So, go Golden Eagles. Yeah. Yes. Are you? Okay. I thought you looked familiar, actually. I still live there. All right. So we're standing up the server again. We're starting at mode 2. The first thing we're going to do is enter an identifier for the sequence key, and all that is a tag to stick on the front of the to tell the client to stick on the front of the sequence key, so the servers know this is the sequence key. This isn't part of real data. Record it as such. So, well, I just use 4 bangs, and you want to make sure also to use the same identifier across all your servers, because the client is just going to pick a random server out and send the sequence key there. The more randomness we can introduce, the less likely we are to get caught. So, client, our server list, same port. We're going to start in mode 2 there on the end. Send 300 byte chunks. The one extra piece, we're going to enter the sequence key ID. So you see, that means that piece of data is going to get tagged. That big long thing I just showed you is going to get tagged with that, so the server knows it's part of the sequence key. Sends the sequence key to a random server, and then starts sending the pieces of file out order. So 43, 54, 12, 2. So you can imagine if I blended this with something like some kind of encryption or encoding, and I'm sending everything out of order, and I was sending it in really small pieces too, and somebody was just trying to guess, I mean, it would be pretty hard to figure out what was going on. Not impossible, but still maybe pretty hard. And then we'll reassemble. The one thing that's different, we're going to enter the path to the file that has our sequence key in it. The server, when it sees the sequence key, will record it in a file called sequencekey.txt. And then we'll enter our reassembly keys again. Reassembly complete. We send everything out of order to multiple servers, and our output looks good again. So that's a little better, but it's still not totally inconspicuous. And we really still need to use lots of small pieces, and lots of small pieces can trigger anomaly detection engines and things because you're making a lot of connections unless you introduce some randomness or some other layer of obfuscation or variance. So can we take the same concepts but hide in plain sight a little bit better? So let's assume, not that this would ever happen, that we have these wonderful layer 7 devices like app proxies and next-gen firewalls, and they understand what an app is supposed to look like at the payload layer, and they understand what port it's supposed to run on, but they don't really know where it lives. Like, I don't really know that LinkedIn doesn't live in Moscow, Russia, or I don't know. Not to offend anybody from Russia in here, but if I haven't already. Lord, I won't mess with them. That's for our president to do. Yeah, anyway. So what happens if I send a good app to a bad place? So let's say I open a connection like this to a server I own, and the firewall really doesn't seem to care about malformed HTTP. Again, we're going to pick on HTTP quite a bit, and I'll explain why. But I send it to a server I own. Our firewall, I did a test just running over and over again, will believe the traffic is that app. Even though it was something I owned, it could have lived anywhere. So why is that? HTTP is wonderful and everything runs over HTTP. Does anybody have guesses why? Seems like everything runs over HTTP now. Well, it works everywhere, right? Everybody allows the web. So if I go to the office, if I go to my house, if I go to the hotel, it's extensible. Everybody knows how to write for it. It's easy to serve. If I have a combination of web and mobile versions of my application, they can talk the same language and I don't have to write proprietary protocols. So you have these vendors that are talking about like, oh, we have 35,000 applications. 80 to 90% of it, if you look in their database, is HTTP. And this is an example of a signature from that particular vendor's firewall. This was to block March Madness streaming basketball a couple of years ago, which is, that's offensive to me, but till my users ate on my bandwidth, it was offensive to me, but then I got a call late at night. I'm not bitter. But you see, basically, it was making a decision based on a method, a URI path, and a host. And that's pretty much what most of these apps, signatures you guys are going to look at on your firewalls and stuff are, guys. That's how they decide. This is LinkedIn, this is Facebook, this is Instagram, this is whatever, right? And that's all they can do because there's really not a good way for them to keep up with every change that a vendor makes in a particular application. So, what we're going to do with FireWay is we're going to actually put randomly named HTTP headers with pieces. We're going to take our file, we're going to base64 encode it. We're going to put pieces of base64, not the whole thing, just pieces of it, inside requests that look like safe or good applications. That's great. Encoding is great for us because we can do binary files, images, text, whatever, and then we could put it all back together on the outside and decode it. So nothing's ever seen its entirety at once. Now what you guys are going to say is, dude, if you start cramming HTTP headers inside that are anomalous and randomly named inside requests, my IPS is going to go nuts. Well, this is the world we live in now. This is a real HTTP request from an app I actually looked at not that long ago. Look at all those headers. And in the world of REST APIs and JWT and a lot of the things we do now, we're getting away from putting stuff down in the post body and we're burying it in headers, particularly in the case of mobile applications. So I can put a lot of custom headers in and junk, and my detective controls cannot stop that because if they did, they would break a lot of things. So, we'll start up our server again, mode 3. It's just, basically here's my reassembly key. We'll start a spoofer. I'm just using a single IP this time, and the other thing here is it will actually ask you if you want to make a DNS request, just a little extra layer of forensic foo, make it a little bit harder. You know, I don't want my client to make a bunch of DNS requests or make a bunch of HTTP requests for things and not have made a corresponding DNS request. That would look a little funky if anybody looked. So we're going to start sending out legit requests with pieces of our file buried in the context of good applications. So HTTP. The other thing that's great about HTTP I should mention is, at least in the version of HTTP we have right now, different in 2.0, but 1.0 and 1.1, it's one request for one resource, right? So we can make like a whole crap ton of requests, and that doesn't look that weird to anybody who's looking at it. It looks like you're surfing the web because you're making a request for every image, every style sheet, every bit of content. So, from Wireshark, this is what this looks like running. You see, basically, I just have a spoof request for the Dropbox root page. I have a randomly named header. I got a little too overzealous with this example, and I should have used a smaller data chunk, but that's just a chunk of the base 64 out of our file. All of you have decoded that in your heads, I know, and you can see exactly what's happening. But, yeah. We'll put it back together. Reassembly keys. That screenshot's really bad. I took some of these at like 2 in the morning, so my eyes were a little crossed. The file's reassembled, and everything just looked like a good app. Yes, sir?
Can you decide what services you spoof?
Can you decide what services you spoof? That's a good question. It is very easy to modify inside the code. There's basically just an array that has them all in there, and you can add them in. And I'm going to get to one limitation of that here in just a second. I think it's on the next slide. Yeah, so I'm the first person that will criticize my own tools and tell you if something doesn't do what it should do. But hey, look, it's pretty good proof of concept. At no point is the data seen in its entirety. They look like good apps. They look like normal web surfing traffic. But, you know, you do get a little bit of incongruency with FireWay. So you're sending a lot of requests out, and what's coming back is just the control traffic because we're using raw Python sockets. So if somebody was looking, that would look a little funny. Same IP. I really should fix this, but I'm super lazy. You could have different apps mapped, so like you could send YouTube to an IP one time and then like Dropbox the next time or Facebook or whatever. And that might look a little weird, although in the case of cloud services, yeah, maybe right. You know, you find out if 2 different apps are hosted on AWS, it may not look that strange. The other thing is it's really just kind of requests for root pages right now. So you get that effect in the log where you see a lot of that like application-base traffic. But it would be easy enough to put some different types of requests in, you know, just messaging or whatever, and make things look a little more stealthy. But hey, I mean, like I said, it's worked for me as a proof of concept, and it's, you know, fooled a lot of socks, and I haven't made many friends with it. So anyway, let's see, we're running 39 minutes. That's pretty good. All right, so we've talked a lot about outbound today, right? But I want you guys to think about inbound. So how challenging is using concepts like this where you're just getting a piece or a chunk of something and you're getting maybe a random piece and it's not in order, make it to detect malware. So if my client goes a whole bunch of different places and I'm just getting 5 or 6 bytes, 50 or 60 bytes even, of malware, and it's encoded or encrypted.
It's the whole Frankenstein concept.
Yeah, right. As long as the client understands how to put it back together and it's not all within one stream, it's just a piece, very difficult to detect. The other thing becomes command and control. I make legitimate requests for Facebook. I make legitimate requests, but I do it to servers I own. So all these layer 7 things I have, think like, oh, it's Facebook, it's fine, or whatever, and that's the way it looks in the logs. But I'm sending back maybe spoofed pages or cloned pages, and I've got little bits of command and control inside them. HTML comments or whatever. These vendors can't keep up. And remember, everything's being looked at one way, almost always. It's never being looked at matched on the return. So I think that's the biggest takeaway that I think you guys can get from some of this. And just the DLP too, if you split things into small parts, it doesn't match regular expressions. So that's actually about what I got. I came about 5 minutes ahead of what I planned on. So we have some time for discussion, questions, comments, cuss words. I do have, just a second, I do have a couple of references for you. Brad Woodberg and Dave LaSalle. Brad and Dave are real nice guys. They kind of scratched the surface on some of this stuff back when next-gen firewalls started to become mainstream. And they talked to the vendor, and I talked to the vendor, and we all three of us got the same response, which was, yeah, that's how the platform works. You got to let it out and see layer 7. We're not going to fix it. And yeah, this is 5 years ago these talks were given. The problem still exists today. And yeah. The next gen will address it. And that's about it, guys. So I'll take any questions. Yeah, Mark.
Yes, so I get that you're pushing the envelope here a little bit, not much, but a little bit, to break down the defenses. Do you have recommendations for vendors like this that they can use to help elevate their game on the defense side?
Yeah, I think congruency and bidirectional inspection, particularly in the case of HTTP. And did anybody work with Dan's Guardian? Old proxy and content filter. You would layer it on top of Squid. But it did URL filtering. But one of the things it actually did is it did regex matching in the return content. So you could actually block things. The problem with this is if I try to browse to CNN and CNN does an article like millennial sex or something on the front page, it would block the page from coming back, right? And, the fact that the capability doesn't exist right now to do that congruency or that return inspection, I think is an issue. So that would be my number one recommendation. At least put the capability in the hand of the firewall administrator or the proxy administrator to do that if they want to. Now, if they don't want to, turn it off. But it's an easy enough thing to do, particularly in the case of HTTP-based applications. If you host your own applications and you're looking for things like this, strict header checking. When I get a request for my application, it can only contain these 8 headers. And if I see anything else, or I see anything that looks different than these headers, I need to drop that request. And that's an easy enough thing with the load balancers and things like that to do. Netscaler's the one I'm most familiar with. It can do it, but F5 and other reverse proxies can do it as well, or ISAPI filters and IIS can do it, and Apache. So those would be the things I would think of off the top of my head. Yeah, anybody? Yeah.
Maybe I didn't catch it. Are you varying the size of the chunks?
No, that's a good question. So the question was, are we varying the size of the chunks? Right now, it's just you specify it and it goes in static amounts. I should, yeah. I should. It would be absolutely. And in the case of anomaly detection engines, it would make it infinitely harder for them. But yeah. Do what? No, that's only in the test mode. That's only test mode. It's static. Right. But yeah, but the best way to do it would be to, you pull out your 200 byte chunk and break it into 10 bytes and then 12 bytes and 15 bytes and then eventually set the whole thing. But, the code's not very good, I program in Python based on one of those $4 books I read, learn Python in 30 minutes on Amazon. And,
it's on GitHub, so.
It's on GitHub. Yeah. You should see NoSQL, Matt. That code's really not good. But people have actually fixed that, which I'm appreciative of. But, yeah.
Have you thought about doing randomization of the times that you send?
Yes, I have thought about that, and that is next. I was really just... They will. And this is just concurrent connections. And that's why using HTTP is great, because you do make a lot of connection HTTP in one session. But it really would be better to randomize it a little bit. You're right. Absolutely. So, yeah.
What
could these anomaly engines do to detect your trunking?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And the congruency, which is easy enough to send back. So if you're just looking at a quantitative basis, so like I could send a connect or some data out, and my server could send garbage back to make the quantity look a little more, or the quantity look a little more symmetrical, you know? I think that would help. Flagging on incongruent sizes where I send data out and all that comes back is TCP control traffic. That I think, and a lot of them probably do that already. Those are things off the top of my head I can think of. Yeah. So, what else? Yeah.
Possibly a two-part question.
Sure.
Will you be posting your slides online?
I will put them on the GitHub. Yes. I want to, since I had used some things in them, I need to make sure it's properly sanitized before they go. Yeah.
And the second part was, what was the secret message when you were demonstrating the order part?
Oh, yeah, I can go back to that. Find it again. It was not a secret. It was just numbers. That right there? It's just the order the pieces are going to be sent in. And so that just, you get one message. And that is one of the other drawbacks of the sending the random pieces out. You do have to get a descriptor out somewhere, and that's easy enough to look for. So you would have this one weird-looking message that would go somewhere first, but if you're talking about one transaction in an enterprise of like 63,000 nodes, it's kind of hard to find, you know.
I was just curious if you actually
Yeah.
posted a message there.
No. That was actually just generated by the script, and I just highlighted the numbers. So I'm not very clever, so no. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
You said forensically that you're trying to address this data with someone getting one of these captures and then understanding the 64 and being able to then detect what the source material was.
Right.
You can take a sequence from the beginning, license, and
Well,
sort through that. Try to continue finding that.
you could, and so I want to jump back to.
Long X or
Well, here's the thing, and so this is a terrible example because I used way too large a chunk size. But remember, the header doesn't mean anything on the front, and if you just had 5 letters, you'd have to guess. If you use really little tiny chunks, you would have to guess. Oh, I think this might be base 64 because it doesn't look like base 64, right? You don't have the terminators on the end.
but then I'm somewhat more concerned that the anomaly detection keeps sending out a lot of data.
You are.
But you're not getting hardly.
Right, that's what we're talking about. The incongruency is an issue.
The number of requests you can get larger amounts of data.
Right.
Image or something.
Again, this is a proof of concept tool. This is for proving it out on a structured engagement. But yeah, if you were doing this for real, again, if you're using HTTP, you should be sending clone pages back. You should be sending something back. If you're just doing raw sockets and you just want to get that congruency, just send random data back to the client before you close down the connection. There's a lot of ways to even it out, but yeah. Yeah.
So I think about all the obfuscation and breaking apart
Mm-hmm.
and all these attempts to bypass that detection. And I'm thinking of a standards-based way of doing this, which is HTTP2.
Right.
And I'm curious if you tinker with that at all to see just how abysmally of a failure it's going to be for some of the next-gen firewalls to try to deal with it. And since you're talking with some of those vendors, what are their plans in this space?
Yeah, and that's a great question. So I have tinkered with HTTP2 a little bit, and it does function a little bit differently because you have that. It's more of a stream. It's less like one-to-one resource to request, and I don't see these guys dealing with it yet. I don't see a lot of detection. They're more worried about client-side stuff from some of the vendors I've seen, lumping other things that bolt into the firewall or can talk to the firewall from the client side than they are adding additional features into the firewall, which I think is a shame. But I have run some HTTP2 across this vendor's firewall, and it just sort of looks like it knows it's HTTP, but it doesn't see it as anything really different. Now, that being said, because HTTP2 is stream-based and not one-to-one, you can't send as many chunks across HTTP2 and headers. You really have to compensate for that a different way. So if you send more requests across HTTP2, that's going to look really weird, right? Because it is more of a stream. So continuous conversation instead of one-to-one resource requests. So yeah, anything else? Awesome, guys. Listen, thank you for sticking around. I really appreciate it. This is 10 years I was thinking about it on the way in this morning. This is 10 years I've been doing my talks. I did my first talk at Freaknik, who you guys heard about some of the ceremonies 10 years ago, and I always appreciate people coming out and listening and hearing what I have to say, and it still stuns me they do. So really appreciate you guys sticking around. Thank you.